Hey ballerinas, welcome back to Reformation Rambles, a series on my channel where we talk about the history of the European Reformation. Today, as promised last week, we're going to continue talking about Martin Luther and the rise of Lutheranism in Germany. Starting with Chapter 1. Knights and Peasants. First of all, I feel like I need to explain what knights were in the 1500s. The Imperial Knights of the Holy Roman Empire had lost a lot of prestige from sort of what we picture the medieval knight to be. It was more a title, it didn't necessarily reflect such a level of honour and such a level of success as it had done in the past. They were quite keen to cling to the power that they'd previously had. They were also very opposed to papal interference in secular affairs. And that's where Luther's works came in, because according to Luther's writing, papal interference in secular affairs was wrong. There are sort of two main leaders of what would become an uprising of the Imperial Knight around 1522. And they were Ulrich von Hutten. I do apologise for my pronunciation to any of my German. Feel free to fully correct me in the comments. And Franz von Sickingen. Franz actually offered to defend Luther personally. Now this was really no different to the princes defending Luther in an attempt to increase their own power. They were doing it for themselves rather than for a belief in a system or a belief in a religion. They very much just wanted to extend their power across the imperial lands to a level that they had previously had. The uprising sort of came to its head in 1522 when the knights attacked the city of Trier. They claimed it was in the name of Lutheranism and they were just trying to wipe Catholicism out of the city. It seems much more likely they just wanted power. The princes really didn't view it as an attempt to spread Lutheranism either. They did view it as an attempt to grab power. The princes successfully defended and dispersed the attack, and a lot of people were executed, including Sickingen. Luther publicly condemned the knights and refused to note any association with them. Now on to what I think is a more interesting discussion, which is the peasants rising up. Now peasants in this time were serfs. They had very few rights. They weren't even able to change which farms they worked on. Their options were so very limited. As well as this, there had been a famine from 1520 to 1524. There was a growing population and increasing pressure on these people who really didn't have very much at all. These people were heavily taxed, they were overburdened, and fundamentally they were hungry. Protests by the peasants began in South Germany, which at this time was the poorer part of Germany. Unfortunately, due to a combination of things, but primarily a lack of education, a lack of full understanding with nuance of Luther's views, because everything they had learned was from woodcuts, and also no clear aims or leaders, which I suppose you could say was due to the lack of intelligence and education. But regardless of this, there was an uprising, there was looting, there were riots, but the peasants were easily led and were essentially annihilated. Two of the leaders in Germany, Philip of Hesse and Frederick, who we've spoken about previously, set about to essentially crush the peasants' rising as it spread across Germany. Most of these peasants had interpreted the woodcuts they'd seen that Lutheranism offered a sense of Christian liberty to the common man, and that realistically the common man was the ideal Christian because they were not taking all of this money and doing a lot of the things that Luther had argued the church were doing wrong, mostly because they couldn't. They didn't have the money, they didn't have the option. And as a result, people had interpreted it as this is the time for peasants to rise up and seize some semblance of power. And this wasn't power in the way the knights were going for it. Realistically, this was basic human rights that they wanted. You can all probably imagine what happened next, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Luther himself has always sided with authority, sided with the princes, sided with the people in power. And this didn't change. He wrote a piece called Against the Murdering and Thieving Hordes of Peasants. Yep. Now, personally, I'm not the biggest fan of Luther. However, nothing about the Reformation makes sense if you don't discuss Lutheranism. And there are a lot of people in this time frame that interact with the Lutheran timeline that I think are far more fascinating. However, Luther's response to this really created this idea that none of the churches were for the common man, and fundamentally cemented the idea that lower class, working class people couldn't choose their religion, and that would remain how it was for a long time. The peasants were crushed by the prince's powers, and around 100,000 people were executed. The peasants would not rise again for hundreds of years. Onwards to chapter 2. The Diets of Speyer. The first Diet of Speyer took place in 1526, and there are a few things you need to know about the world in 1526, well, Europe in 1526, to understand why it went the way it did. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was realistically supposed to support Catholicism across the Holy Roman Empire, was in a bit of a jam. He was at war with both the Ottoman Empire and France, and he relied very heavily on the support of the imperial princes in both of these wars, that he wasn't exactly winning at this time. As a result, when the princes met with Charles V to try and find some way they could reconcile Lutheranism and Catholicism, the ultimate conclusion was that the princes could determine the religion of their land. Essentially, if your prince allowed it, Lutheranism could be legal. Around this time, Philip of Hesse, who I mentioned before, who helped end the Peasants' Rising, converted to Lutheranism, and he would become a key player in years to come. 3 years later, the Second Diet of Speyer took place. By this point, Charles had established a peace with France. The Ottoman Empire had been stopped invading around Vienna. He was in a much more stable and comfortable place and much less reliant on the princes. As a result, he retracted his previous agreement, putting the Edict of Worms back in place. This meant that it was illegal to be Lutheran again. 14 Lutheran princes, 6 cities, all issued their protestation and refusal to comply with this decision. And that is where the word Protestant comes from, and we still use it today. This original protest against trying to force all of the lands to remain Catholic has been worked into our language so much that even without knowing this, we would always still refer to most non-Catholic denominations of Christianity as Protestant. Chapter 3. The Marburg Golloquoy. To understand this, you need to know a brief bit of background about Ulrich Zwingli. I will discuss Zwingli more in a future episode about the Swiss Reformation, but here's a very quick summary. Zwingli was a Swiss humanist. In 1519 he preached Catholic reform. In 1522 he started to actively criticise the Catholic Church, saying that people should not be fasting during Lent, and he introduced a new communion liturgy to replace Mass. Now, him and Luther disagreed on certain points, but fundamentally they both were opposed to the current Catholic system. Philip of Hesse, whom we mentioned before, organised a meeting at Marburg Castle. This was to be a discussion between Zwingli and Luther where they could try and reconcile the points they disagreed on. The aim was to present a unified Protestant church to oppose the Catholic Church with. It didn't work. Now, there were 15 points presented and they managed to reach an agreement on 14 of them. But the 15th, would appear, was a deal breaker. Now, the 15th point was regarding the real presence of Christ during the Eucharist, or Mass. So here's what they both believed. And it sounds ridiculous, but these beliefs were so key to them forming an agreement, but I do think it's important that we discuss this. So, both of them agreed that the bread in the Last Supper was a sign. However, Luther thought Christ was actually present in the bread. You were literally eating the body of Christ. Zwingli thought it was more symbolic, and you were supposed to recognise Christ's love as you ate the bread, but it wasn't literally him. They couldn't agree on this. They argued for days. At one point, At one point Luther started to carve in the table. I know, what is this, school? He started to carve into the table, "Das ist mein Leib," which translates to, "This is my body." There was no room for agreement, neither of them were going to budge on this topic. Despite agreeing on so much, the two just couldn't reconcile on this one subject. Having said that, they were more respectful towards each other in their writings after this fact. But it was largely accepted after this that other branches of Protestantism couldn't necessarily reconcile as the same belief system as Lutheranism. Chapter 4. The Schmalkaldick League. The decision to not allow the princes to determine the religion of their areas was not just made at the Second Diet of Speyer, but solidified at a Diet of Augsburg in 1530. This led to the Protestants essentially building a military. This was known as the Schmalkaldick League. It was led by Philip of Hesse and John of Saxony. And in 1532 they claimed to have 12,000 men. In 1532, Charles re-granted tolerance of Lutheranism. Of course, this wasn't just a nice, light-hearted decision. He was under attack from the Ottoman Empire again. He needed men, he needed money, and if he agreed to tolerate Lutheranism, the Schmalkaldick League said they would give him both men and money. But the damage was already done. In 1534, the city of Württemberg was invaded, essentially, by the Schmalkaldick League. This was, at the time, a Catholic area. They reinstated their previously exiled leader. As time went on, more and more cities would join this league. Mainly due to political disagreements with Charles, Francis I of France and Henry VIII of England both said they would defend the Schmalkaldick League. By the time they were invading Württemberg, they claimed to have an army of 20,000 men. In 1538, a Catholic League was formed to oppose the Schmalkaldick League. Essentially, this is literally just two factions of Christendom at war across Europe. However, by 1541, the Protestant movement across Germany was seen as completely unstoppable. There was a meeting at Rendsburg to try and find common ground between Catholicism and Lutheranism, and it was essentially deemed impossible by this point. The movement had moved so rapidly from it really sort of kicking off in the 1520s. There was no way to reconcile it with the Catholic Church anymore. France withdrew its support for the Schmalkaldick League in 1549 after the Peace of Crepy with Charles. In 1545, Charles also reached a truce with the Ottomans. Let's talk about 1539. Let's talk about Philip of Hesse. Now, Philip of Hesse had become a spearhead of the Lutheran campaign. If you were discussing Lutheranism, he would come up. He was one of the primary leaders of the movement. He was one of, as a founder of the Schmalkaldick League, he was eternally going to be associated with this change in religion across the country. In 1539, already married Philip of Hesse decided he was going to marry someone else as well. He wrote to Luther to request permission. Martin Luther was very aware that Philip of Hesse was going to do what he wanted anyway, so just said yes. This would form some incredible propaganda for the Catholic Church to turn people against Lutheranism, and this is really the point at which we first see any decline in this moving ahead of the movement. Having said that, Protestantism wasn't going anywhere. 5. The Peace of Augsburg. So before we get to the actual peace itself, let's discuss a battle. In 1547, the Battle of Marburg took place. This was the first time the Protestants suffered any huge defeat in battle. This was at the hand of Charles, and Philip of Hesse surrendered. The Schmalkaldick League disbanded, but by 1540 the Liga Torgau formed, and Charles once again, could not afford another war. So in 1555 the Peace of Augsburg happens. This was signed by Charles. Princes could choose their own religion, but they were only allowed to choose Catholicism or Lutheranism. Any other religion was not permitted, and you had to stick to whatever religion the prince that presided over you had chosen. Individuals could not decide on their own religion. They also agreed that Catholics and Protestants had to be equally represented at all future diets. This didn't fix a lot of the underlying issues, it was simply an acknowledgement of a truce and that the current situation of war was ending. It also recognised once and for all that Catholicism and Lutheranism were utterly irreconcilable by this point. Despite this, the fighting between the factions would not end until well in the 1580s. Charles V abdicated not long after in 1556. It's said he had a mental breakdown because his ultimate job of protecting Catholicism had failed. And that's how Lutheranism and the Protestant Church got started across Europe. But that's one tiny corner of Europe, and what happened everywhere else is just as wild. And next week we'll talk about Switzerland. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, give me a cheeky like and subscribe. Let me know who your favourite person who took part in the German Reformation is in the comments, and I will see you guys later. Bye!